Up next, we have our panel on the 1968 Columbia Student Uprising. I'm really glad to be joined by Eleanor Stein, Mike Golash, and Mark Rudd, three organizers and some of the key players in that movement. And yeah, hopefully we'll just get a chance to discuss a little bit about the legacy of those protests, how they got involved with them, how the struggle for justice at Columbia has continued throughout the institution's history, and how that connects with our work today. So thank you all so much for being here. It's great to have you. I was thinking maybe we could just start with some introductions, maybe just a little bit about what your role was in the 1968 occupation, how'd you get involved, and what that's kind of led you to do now, what you're involved with, what you do. I'll pass it off to Eleanor first, if you want to start.
Great, thank you. And what a wonderful day this has been. I want to congratulate you on the fantastic panelists and really vibrant and groundbreaking discussions. And I also want to congratulate you on the capitulation by Columbia University in terms of its investments in fossil fuels. It's really so important. And to let you know that just within the last couple of weeks, New York State also announced that it was divesting its pension funds and its investments held by the comptroller in fossil fuels. So we're all part of the same movement. It's really a great step. So great work. So I was a law student at Columbia in 1968, and I participated in the demonstrations that led to the takeover of 5 buildings. And I don't know how familiar people are with what happened, but I'm sure in the course of the next, whatever we have, 45 minutes, you'll give you a good sense. So there were only 5 law students who actually participated in the building takeovers. And I was sitting in my contracts class in the back of the class. It was a beautiful April afternoon. And I heard chanting outside and went out with my partner in crime, Gus Reichbach, who died several years ago, but was a great leader at Columbia. And we saw a group of students marching on the site of the new gymnasium that Columbia was proposing to build in Morningside Park, one of the few green spaces in Harlem. And I joined that group. We tore down some fence. We tried to disrupt the site, and then we came back, and one of the women in the demonstration said, "Let's go to Hamilton Hall and have a sit-in." And so that's what we did. And it soon became a move-in, and we were, in the end, occupied 5 university buildings. We were there for 1 week, and on April 30th, the university called the police, and I think about 730 people were arrested in a pretty violent retaking of the property by the police. So I was involved. When I first got there, I had an armband that said legal observer because I was a law student and I wasn't completely committed to doing this yet. But I took that off after about a day. And I later met a friend who was at the medical school who had an armband that said medical presence. So I think those of us who had a sort of professional self-image were challenged to shed that privilege in the course of those 7 days in the buildings, which was a larger theme for everyone, I think, who participated. So I think we'll talk later about what the demands were and what the issues were, but that was my role. But since then, I spent many years doing radical work when I left Columbia, and finally went back to law school. I tried to get back to Columbia, but they wouldn't readmit me. And for the last many years, I've been working in the field of climate change as a practitioner, as an advocate, and as a teacher since 2005. So that is the core of my work at this point, and I'll be talking more about that later.
Great. Thank you so much, Eleanor. Definitely a lot of different issues around justice, all kind of intertwined here, that I think is definitely room for a lot more discussion. But I want to pass it off to Mark, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Oh, I don't see Mark.
Unmute.
Ah, this is Mike.
Okay. Oh,
I think you're on mute, Mark. Yeah, we're
Mike
good.
or Mark?
Mark. Mark Rudd.
I don't see Mark. Is he here?
Um,
Okay.
There he is.
I have an unstable connection. Can you see me?
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. Townsend, should I continue?
Yeah, please go for it. I think we're good.
Okay, good. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for putting this together. And thank everybody who's involved in the strike. It seems fabulous. Seems like um, you're doing most everything right, and that's great. Um, I was 20 years old in April of 1968, a junior at Columbia College. Um, I had entered as a freshman in September of 65, which was only a few months after the United States invaded Vietnam with main force troops in March and April of 65. The first people I met at Columbia were people who were in the predecessor of the Students for Democratic Society chapter. It was called the Independent Committee on Vietnam. And those people were already studying the war and trying to figure out what it was about and protesting the war. So I fell in with these people, kind of like they were the coolest people around, and they wanted to change the world. And um, that many of them were red diaper babies, meaning they had grown up in families in the labor movement, socialist or communist. Um, these were people who knew about something called organizing. And so I didn't know anything at all. I was just in New Jersey. So, they said, well, we have to build a base. We have to figure out how our war movement. And over the next years, the strategy we followed, or the goal of the strategy, was to politicize the campus. In other words, to make Vietnam and racism important issues to people's lives. So there's a lot that happened in the next years, and in fact, this organizing had been going on for several years. Before I got there, I was just a freshman in '65, but by '68, a number of things. I call it the perfect storm of the spring of '68. The Tet Offensive, the murder of Martin Luther King, the abdication of LBJ, and he decided not to run again. All of these things came together, but on a base. This is the thing, of a lot of activity over a lot of years. Especially education and agitation. And so in March of '68, or maybe I was elected chairman of the chapter. Bunch of things happened to set things off. And Eleanor has told some of what happened, but I just want to stress one more point, which was that the activist group of Black students on campus was known as the Student Afro-American Society. We call it SAS. They had been developing really close relationships with the Harlem community. And they many of them had come out of families that had been involved in the civil rights movement, or historically probably, and they felt a deep connection with the community. And so when the community started protesting and the construction of the gym in Morningside Park, they felt that they needed to act by a wonderful series of happenstance. Right before a big demonstration to be held on April 23rd, I met with leadership of the SAS, the Student Afro-American Society, and they decided to co-sponsor a rally opposing certain discipline action from previous demonstration, and also protesting the gym. And so they were very present at that big demonstration on April 23rd. And as a consequence of a bunch of different things that happened spontaneously and almost unplanned, they and we found ourselves not only at tearing down the fence at the construction site, but occupying Hamilton Hall together. Later, they asked us to leave later that night, and this was the key point. The Black students held Hamilton Hall, and the other 4 buildings and all the people outside the buildings were there in solidarity. And one rallying cry that we had was, "We can't abandon the Black students." So it's taken a long time for people to understand, I mean, for white people to understand, including myself, that the key factor was this coalition that got built. So when I talk about Columbia and Columbia with people, I tend to stress both the organizing that went into it over a long period of time and the coalition that got built. And certain of the leaders of SAS have written and said over the years that the Black students who held Hamilton Hall were the strategic strength of the strike. That's something to consider. Any kind of successful movement that we build in the past and the future has got to have long-term strategic organizing, and which includes coalition building. That's all I want to say at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. I totally agree with that. Thank you so much for emphasizing, the absolute essentialness of solidarity and the role that like Black organizers had to play in 1968. Certainly essential. I'll pass it off to Mike, if we could just get, kind of your involvement in the strike and what your reflections on it are.
Okay, well, my involvement was, I was on the SDS expansion committee. I was chairman of the committee, and that basically was the group within SDS that developed opposition to the gym among the students and reached out to community members to join in opposition. So about 3 or 4 months before the strike began, William Ryan, who was the congressman on the Upper West Side, had a community meeting, and we organized some community members and students to break into that meeting and insist that he take a stand against Columbia's building the gymnasium. He didn't do that, obviously, but it made it clear to many community members that the community and students were against the gym construction. Then about a month or so, 6 weeks, I remember the exact, before the big demonstrations, began construction on the gym. And myself and a few other Columbia students, Kendall Smith, who was a Harlem minister, we went over to the gym site and wouldn't let them start. We sat down in front of the machines, they arrested us, and they started construction, basically. About 2 weeks later, we did the same thing again, different group of people. I'd already been arrested once, I did my duty. So we got another group of people arrested. And this basically, through this and a lot of agitation all around the campus, we basically switched the story from one where I think in the beginning of the semester, like they had a poll and like 75 or 80% of the students were in favor of building the gymnasium. By the time of the march and the sit-ins, I say 90% of the students had switched to being opposed to building the gymnasium, basically. So that agitational work, educational work, the relations we developed with the community, and then the key role of Black students actually agreeing to participate in the struggle made a big difference, basically. So that was my role. And in the particular, before that, what I got involved when I first arrived at Columbia as a graduate student in engineering, I got involved in the Committee Against the Vietnam War, the Peace Committee. I worked with Seymour Melvin to do research on the atrocities, the American military in Vietnam. I went to Chicago with a bunch of other people from Columbia to the Peace Committee, Conference on Peace, Politics thing was called. Martin Luther King spoke there. We, got me revved up. We came back, we organized for the October 1967 March on the UN. King spoke again. So those are the type of things that got me involved. And what do I do now? I'm retired. I worked for the Metro, the transit system in Washington for 35 years. I became union president, led a big strike of 6,000 workers, illegal strike, got fired, got my job back, went on to an illustrious career, or some would say an infamous career, depending on your political outlook with Metro.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much, Matt. And I think, it all began with something that we don't get a lot in the left, which is a victory, that the movement at Columbia, the protests, they worked. They didn't build the gym, they stopped the investment with the Vietnam organization, the Department of Defense investment or research, I guess it was. So, right.
Right.
So, yeah, I want to kind of pivot then to talking about just a little bit, you all have kind of gone disparate paths, but it started with this one point that combined a lot of different issues. You have, on the one hand, the war in Vietnam happening halfway across the world, and on the other hand, gentrification, segregation happening in Columbia's own backyard. So, yeah, I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit. I mean, I know for us organizing this tuition strike, we are constantly faced with the question from people of like, why do you have so many issues? Why not just pick one and go with it? And, I to help me out, if you could answer that question, what is the relationship between these issues? Why do you think they're all kind of intertwined? And what kind of broader vision of the university do you think comes out of this?
Well, I think that that's a great question. Let me just add before I go into that, just a little more of the context which Mark laid out so well, because I think until this year, 1968 was a year of unparalleled upheaval. But I think this year has been a lot like 1968, although obviously different in many ways. I mean, between 40 and 50,000 Americans were killed in Vietnam. We've had 10 times that number have died of the coronavirus this year. It's a staggering concept. But 68, there was, it was a revolutionary year. And it was not just in the United States, it was students and workers in France and Japan and Germany and Mexico, all over the world. And so we did have a sense of being part of an international movement. We had, as Mark said, there was a long history of organizing against the Vietnam War and educating people, teach-ins like the one you're doing, a very familiar form, although ours were in person. And so all of that was a basis. Almost 15,000 Americans were killed in Vietnam just in the year 1968. And so for us, the cost of an unjust and illegal war and the torment of understanding that it was our country that was fighting this war in our name was all consuming. And then you had, we'd been through the civil rights movement, and then in April 1968, King was killed, April 4th, and the cities around the country just exploded in rebellion and in military repression. Rebellion on a similar scale to what we saw this year from the Movement for Black Lives, and then military repression on a whole other level, including in the Capitol. So those things set the stage. And they also created the situation where we began to see the interrelationship of issues. And that's why this is relevant to your question. And that we were seeing a system at work and recognizing a system and naming it. We called it imperialism. I think now we're calling it racial capitalism. A lot of people today tried on different names, but I think we're all getting at the same thing. Understanding the relationship between a system of international exploitation by the US government and the system of oppression and subjugation of people of color within the United States, and then coming to understand or to grapple with what was our role of people in a privileged university, at this moment in our lives, and how did we see ourselves and our own lives. So I honor you for this range of issues, for understanding and presenting the fundamental interrelationship that comes from the system of oppression that we're talking about, and to be willing to take on some of the toughest issues. And in particular, I'll call you out on the issue of Palestine, which is an issue that a lot of progressive organizations and movements and people won't touch. And you had a wonderful, wonderful panel on Palestine today, groundbreaking. So you're not afraid to take on the tough issues, and you understand that that's a moral obligation. So I give you all the credit for doing that.
Well, thank you so much, Eleanor. I mean, we wouldn't be where we're at without our coalition partners and so many other people who contributed to this movement. We're standing on the shoulders of many giants that have contributed to the activist, the leftist work at Columbia. Mark or Mike, do you have anything else to add? If not,
I think that we centered on a number of different issues, but really the issue of the interrelation between the war and racism is what drove the movement forward and made it successful, basically. If we hadn't had the issue of racism front and center and had the leadership of those Black students, I'm not sure if the whole thing would have succeeded or not. And I think that's really an important point for people to understand. Even today, it's Black workers in this country who are going to provide the leadership for social transformation, basically.
There's another point that one of your panelists on the Palestinian Hour made, I think it was on that discussion, which was talking about the idea of the interrelationship among issues, and that it's not just a slogan. It also creates the conditions where you can mobilize many different constituencies together, and that augments the strength of your organizing work enormously. And I think you've shown that by creating such a strong coalition. So it's not just the words, it's actually very meaningful on the ground.
Absolutely. Actions speak much louder than words. Mark, go ahead. Is Mark there?
Mike's mentioning that he was a graduate student set off a whole train of thought that is relevant to your question. I was an undergraduate and really didn't know very much about imperialism, nor the Black struggle in the South. But the graduate students that were involved in SDS were incredibly important to the rest of us. They taught us. They probably taught us much more. People like Mike taught us much more than our professors, because they had been trying to figure out what was going on in the world, not just imperialism, but domestically too. And so it was the graduate students who made the difference for me in understanding all these connections. So I have a question for you, which is, I'm sorry I haven't been able to participate in the webinar today, But I have a question concerning the organization. Are graduate students heavily involved? The reason I ask this question is in other struggles that I've seen over the years, the graduate students have not been involved. They've been kind of segregated in their own work. About the role of graduate students?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're really great to, have a lot of really good coalition partners and a lot of core organizers that are graduate students. The GWC, the Graduate Workers Coalition, that's the UAW union that is currently organizing graduate workers, has been one of our core allies in this fight. That one of our 5 demands is demanding that the university bargain in good faith, which is something that they just have never done with GWC. And as well as we have had the postdoctoral workers union sign on. And then we also have some of our core organizers, our students at Teachers College. We have tons of support amongst the School of Social Work, as you might expect, So we really have appreciated just how supportive, enthusiastic graduate workers have been, and we definitely wouldn't be here where we are without them. I just want to, before we move on to the next question, we've been joined by Tom Hurwitz, another organizer of the tuition strike. So we'd love to get Tom, love to have you here. Thank you so much for being here. Do you want to just introduce yourself, say maybe a word or two about your role in the 1968 protests?
Hello, everybody. It's great to see you all.
Hi, Tom.
It's been, it seems to come every several years now.
Mhm.
Less than once a decade, which is good. So I was in Math Hall and in the leadership in Math Hall during the strike. And I was a student at the college. Then I was active in SDS for the next year after that. And then I was an organizer in the anti-war GI movement for a few years after that, until I went, and now I'm a documentary filmmaker.
Awesome.
And have been for 40 years or more.
Yes. No, I think I've actually seen some of your documentary films. But in any case, I think, it's great to have you here. Glad to have you join. We were just talking about how some of the core issues of the strike, or rather of the occupation in 1968, were all interrelated. How, racism, militancy, capitalism, they're all part of this broader system of oppression that we need to oppose. And yeah, it's, I think, really important to be able to get your perspective and hear from that kind of experience and how that continues on to today. But one thing I'm wondering about is looking back at your experience and at that legacy of movement building. Obviously, this was part of a much broader student movement that stretched from, Jackson State to Berkeley. I'm wondering if maybe you all could say a little bit about what do you think that student movement got right? What do you think it got wrong? What would you have done differently if you did it again today?
Well, let me say, I think what the whole movement got right was the idea that capitalism, imperialism was at the root of the problem, basically. I think that was became a fairly widespread idea, basically within the whole movement. But I think there was a lot of things done wrong. One is I don't think we understood the centrality of racism to the maintenance of the capitalist system. That racism is, a key ingredient to maintain capitalism. It's a class question. It hurts all workers, Black workers, people of color, worse than white workers, but it hurts all workers. I don't think we had a really clear understanding of that at the time, basically. And then I don't think we had a real clear understanding of what to do about this stuff. In other words, I came to the conclusion the only way we're going to get rid of this whole system is getting rid of capitalism itself, building a revolutionary party, organizing among the working class, fighting racism and sexism, and getting rid of this capitalist system and building an organization which is capable of doing that. You know, the whole history of the communist movement is scarred with China, Russia, Eastern Europe, et cetera, and overcoming all those obstacles. You know, no, communism is the next stage of human history, getting people to understand that. And that's the only way we're gonna have true freedom and a decent life. We still really don't fully understand that, but I think that's the direction we have to move. So, like this meeting today, I didn't hear anybody talk about revolution. It's about, oh, Bernie, he did a great job. Oh, he's another capitalist politician. Yeah, so what? Let's build a movement of the working class to destroy capitalism.
I think there was a lot of discussion about that today, actually, but I think, I actually think that when I look back at Columbia, I take away the message of solidarity. Mark brought this up strongly with the Black struggle. And so I think, obviously, we didn't overcome privilege. There was much more that could have been done. But I think the concept of solidarity is key for building a left movement in this country was strongly part of what happened there. And you know, when I look back, did we sustain it? You know, we all spent a lot of our lives since then fighting for change and of different kinds, and keeping that message of anti-racism as key, and understanding our system as a system of racial capitalism as key. So that's a strong legacy. Did we overthrow the government? We did not. Even the French students didn't succeed in overthrowing the government, and they had a strong alliance with the workers. So what can I say? You know, the revolutionary history is littered with partial successes and large failures until it isn't. So I feel like that is a strong legacy. I think the other strong legacy is the importance of activism, both organizing and also taking to the streets, being willing to take over property, make it our own, at least for a week. And I think we definitely posed a threat to the university. There were some great portraits of the university all day today during the different sessions. And I was struck by how little it's changed, in the sense that it's still a gigantic real estate conglomerate with a small subsidiary in higher education. And that hasn't changed at all since 1968. So, but it is one of the key pillars of capitalist system in this city and in the country. And I think we shook it. We didn't bring it to the ground, but we did shake it. And we're all still in it. So what more can you do?
Absolutely. Yeah, does anyone have any other thoughts on this question? Otherwise, I'd be happy to move on.
One of the things I took away from the '68 struggle, Eleanor mentioned it, but is the primacy of organizing. We forgot that, some of us, but the importance of organizing and educating, it just can't be understated, can't be overstated. We really have to. We have to be out there working with people, and the Georgia election makes that very clear. You know, calling for things and proclaiming things and doing dramatic action, and I was very much in favor of that at the time, is very important. But the down-to-earth work of organizing is just crucial to any movement, and explaining, because I got to tell you, the ultra-right is organizing, and if there's to be a viable left, and I mean, I think you guys are doing really extraordinary work, and I think that's great. And I think we need to be aware that anti-fascism is going to be probably the task of the moment. It's not the task of the left at any given time isn't always the same. We have to be strategic, and we have to be tactical, and we have to understand where we are and what we should do in relation to that. And fascism is a huge danger in this country, and I think we need to think very seriously about that while you build your strength and do what you need to do at Columbia in terms of the issues that you're facing.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. Thank you for that. Mark, do you want to go ahead?
Just following up on Tom's comment about organizing. Before Tom came when I spoke last time, I mentioned learning from the Red Diaper Babies the mantra: build the base, build the base, build the base, and that's what we got right, especially at Columbia, I think. And everything else that people have talked about interrelationships of issues and imperialism at the core and capitalism, but I'm just going to speak for myself now. Post Columbia, before I get into this, the student movement as a whole was part of the civil rights movement, or the Black freedom movement, and part of the anti-war movement, the movement against the war in Vietnam. And in both, the student movements played huge roles in these successful movements. So that's the main thing that has to be understood. We were part of these bigger movements, and we fed into them, and they were successful movements in limited ways. We did not end imperialism. We did not end white supremacy, but that's a big story. Having said that the student movements were part of successful movements, I want to go into a problem that occurred with me and the people closest with me, which was that we forgot about the organizing, literally. And we thought that our militancy leading up to April 23rd, 68 had been what was important. And of course, this doesn't pertain to a lot of people like Mike, but it does pertain to those of us who got involved in a fact which came directly. I just got am I still on?
Yeah,
Yes.
you're
Breaking up a little.
You're breaking up a bit, but you're there.
Which came it came directly out of Columbia in a way. And it was this emphasis on militancy that we misunderstood. It's kind of like, you might call it self-expression. We had a theory that if we did active militancy, many other people would join us. It didn't work. It didn't work. And this faction grew to be moderately big within SDS and led a year later in 69 to a faction fight within SDS over the question, who is going to be the revolutionary agent or the agency of revolution? This is the kind of things that Marxist intellectuals love to talk about, the agency of revolution. In other words, we have ideas and we push these ideas. We were part of a huge fantasy that this country was ripe for revolution. And that fantasy was not only in the student movement, it existed a lot of movements. In fact, it was at the core of Black Power. It's time for revolution, and by any means necessary. And the interaction of Black Power with white students like myself, that's an enormous question that in other words, we pushed each other reciprocally. But this fantasy played out in negative ways. Namely, not long, a little over a year after Columbia 68, the weather faction of SDS was in control of the national organization. And a small, tiny cabal, a grouping of which I was a member, decided to close SDS because it wasn't revolutionary enough. That's crazy. That was insane. And in addition to that, well, I won't go into all the ramifications, but by the time of Kent State in May of 1970, in other words, 2 years after Columbia, we had an anomalous situation in which millions of students were out on strike against the war and against the murders, and protesting the murders at Jackson State, and because we had destroyed it because it wasn't revolutionary enough. In other words, we got all caught up in our ideas, our revolutionary ideas, and we thought they were real, and we acted on them. That's a mistake, terrible mistake. The only proof we had of our ideas was that we had them. That's not very much proof. I'll stop with this little story, other than to say we've got to be rooted in data and accountability. And I'm really happy now that, for example, DSA and Jacobin and are moving in the direction that it's much more realistic. And so there's a lot more to be said about that, but I'll shut up.
I would say, Mark, that I totally agree with you. The thing that gives me faith is actually Black Lives Matter. I think that their work has been extraordinary, and their sophistication in the way that they organize and the way that they see the situation. They've been quieter during the election, and during this last period, but they are tremendous. I have tremendous respect for the people that I know and I've heard in that group. And there are similar people in the Latinx movement as well. And there's a kind of a sophistication and a clarity about in the new mass movements that I find very impressive at this point. And I think the danger, Mark, is I agree with you very much about that. It's very easy, and it's not only easy for students, it's easy for a lot of people to get flipped out into their ideas. And I think, I don't want to accuse anybody of anything, but I think we can see something of that danger happening in Seattle and Portland right now, in which people have kind of stopped. They don't really even know why they're in the street, but they're in the street. And because that's what they have defined themselves as. So I think that, anyway, I agree with you. I think looking at the truth and looking at reality and analyzing the reality and figuring out what our task is in relationship to the reality is a very difficult process, but you can't have a left if you don't do it. Otherwise, it'll go into a tailspin and destroy itself.
You know, I see a history a little differently, although probably less differently than I did certainly less than I did at the time. But I do think that that the anarchists and the Antifa people today are actually they are holding a core of an important idea. Although I completely agree with everything that you said, Tom, about Movement for Black Lives, which also preceded this, volcanic year with years of organizing. Did not just arise this year by any means. But I think that we are facing, and we are in the midst of really something that feels like a civil war. And looking, Trump is gone, but 73 million people who voted for him are not gone. And his ideology is not gone, and his delusions are not gone. And I think it's very hard to see from where we're standing how that's going to play out over the next few years. But I think, this is a triumphant week in many ways, but it's also a sobering week because we know how hard it's going to be to get really anything done. And in the sense of the urgency of moving on racism and moving on climate justice at the same time, and all the other things, the incredible immiseration of people in this country in the last year, the deaths. I mean, and are we going to be able to do it given the scale of the opposition? I think that's a major issue. I'm not suggesting that we make the same choices that we did in 1969, however. But I would be curious, Towns, to know if we have time to know from you, how do you and your colleagues in the different groups in your coalition, what is your view of, what is this historical moment? What is the meaning of this year? How do you see your efforts in this larger context?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say first, I have no idea if I'm qualified to speak on this. I mean, I think we're figuring it out, and we certainly don't know exactly what the ramifications of everything is going to be. But I think, for us, it is absolutely, I think, a lot of what you all have been touching on, which is like, we need to put this kind of material reality before our ideals. We can't just get carried away by having the right ideas. We need to be taking the world where it's at and figuring out, how can we actually make change in it? How can we make real material, practical change in it? And so this tuition strike emerged over the summer, having a series of town hall meetings with students from across Columbia University, talking to them about, hey, what are your biggest issues? What do you think are the things that you'd like to see changed at Columbia? And realizing, finances, money, is the through line through a lot of it, that getting Columbia to lower tuition would go a huge way in helping people resolve a lot of different issues and just qualitatively improving the quality of people's lives. So yeah, we kind of realized that. And then we thought, okay, well, how can we take real direct material action to do something about that? Not just say it, but take the action. And so that was when we started to kick around the idea of a tuition strike, and yeah, we've been really, sort of encouraged by how much success we've had so far. And yeah, continue, I think, to want to, use this, I think, as a stepping off point to continue to develop the sort of political force of the university, to develop the sort of democratic will of students and staff and faculty and the broader community, having that be expressed in Columbia's decision-making process, and using this as a stepping stone in political education, because ultimately students are only at school for 4 years. So we need to be thinking about, okay, how do we take this beyond just Columbia? How do we take this to other schools and to people's lives for the rest of the time that they're going to be working and living in the world? Which I think is a kind of perfect pivot to my last question. Well, second to last. I'll have a short one at the very end. But I want to know, what do you think is the role of student organizing in society with these kind of conditions? You're at school for 4 years. You're in an obviously very rarefied, very elite space at Columbia. What do you think that students can really do with that, particular privilege and the particular constraints therein of being at like a school?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is they can renew and intensify the fight against racism. And they fight others. If you look at Columbia, I'm not sure what the demographics are, but I'm willing to bet that the average income family of Columbia is over $100,000, which means you probably have excluded most people of color from an opportunity of going to Columbia, basically. So, you know, that issue really has to be addressed. Otherwise, that poorer people should be able to go to better institutions. I mean, all college should be free, but, you know, we're at Columbia. Let's try and deal with that issue, basically. Why do only people that make a lot of money go to Columbia? Every once in a while, they let a poor person in, yes, but that's not the demographics of the population. So that issue has to be addressed, particularly for people of color, but also for people from poor working class families, which there are a lot of them, basically. The second thing is, I think students have to fight capitalist ideology, or you're taught a lot of nonsense in schools. I mean, and that has to be broken down, basically. That's what Marxism, communism is all about. A scientific approach to the world, dialectic materialism. People should learn about that stuff. They don't. You teach just the opposite. You teach idealism and religion and a lot of nonsense, basically. And the other thing is, I think students have to win to be supporting workers' struggles. In other words, students aren't going to change the world. They can stimulate struggle. They can stimulate rebellions. That's what happened in France in 1968. But it was really up to the working class to pick up on that and provide leadership and transform society. And so, I mean, that's the role that students can play. But while they're in this process, they can learn how to build an actual organization which can lead to working class revolution, basically. They can inculcate themselves with that idea. I mean, I've talked to a lot of students. There's still a lot of anti-communism. There's still a lot of organizations, authoritarianism, there's anti-democratics, a lot of, you know, they got to get away from those ideas. If you don't have an organization that's structured and has a good set of ideas, you're not going to transform society. You're not going to do it by doing your own thing, basically.
You know, I would say that we were very fortunate to be young in the 1960s. And I think you and the people who were speaking today are very fortunate to be young in this moment in time, where in some ways the odds are so high. They're so high, and the stakes are so high. The stakes on climate, we only have a few years to get it right and to get off fossil fuels. As Bill McKibben said recently, in climate, winning slowly is the same as losing. We have so little time. And of course, all the other issues that you were talking about today. And, you know, I think you've really defined a great panoply of roles for students. Being willing to take risks, being far-seeing, seeing the connection among issues, linking up different groups with tremendous energy and courage. So I think you know what the role of students are, and I think you're expanding it and giving us lots of new ideas about the ways it can be expanded. So keep it up.
An anonymous attendee wrote in and said, so should we not be utopian? Is it a mistake to want to make revolutionary changes? And I've only got a piece of an answer to that. I think it's great to have a utopian goal and a utopian faith in human beings. And at the same time, we need to keep our eyes on what, so that's keeping our eyes on the prize. And at the same time, we have to keep our eyes on what's in front of us and what's happening now. If you only have one, you're in serious trouble.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you get stuck in the ins and outs of the Democratic Party on one side, and you become what we became by mistake in our worst aspect at the end of the student movement. So you gotta strike a balance. That's the key to all of this. It's essential, and you have to re-examine what that balance is continually. You have to keep an eye on yourself and what's going on out there. You have to constantly be analytical. It's critical.
I think I spent most of my life organizing for revolution, but I also kept my eye on the fact I have to do things to improve people's lives as best I can today. So there is a dialectic between the two things. If you go to Washington, D.C. and talk to the transit workers there, you'll find out they're some of the best paid workers in the country. They have a guaranteed pension for the rest of their life. They have health insurance to the day they die. So those were accomplishments we fought for. But now in a period of neoliberalism and political and economic crisis, they're trying to take away all those things. So we've got to win the workers to understand these gains that we made today are not permanent as long as we allow the capitalists to hold state power and to run our society. So if you want to hold on to a decent life for yourself and your children, you better have a utopian vision of the future, because the future without that is hell, fascism, whatever you want to call it. It's not particularly good. So I'm for building a revolutionary party. I'm for helping workers in their day-to-day struggle, but I'm also keeping my eye on the prize, getting rid of capitalism. That's why I joined the Progressive Labor Party 40 years ago, why I'm still organizing it today, and I'll organize it to the day I die, and I'll try to recruit as many people as I can to it so we can accomplish this historic goal. I'm probably not going to see it in my lifetime, but maybe my children or my grandchildren will do it. Amen.
Yeah. I hope we will. I mean, I hope someone will someday. I think you all have basically answered my last question, which was just going to be, do you have any advice for students today?
Towns,
yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah. I think the role of students is, I'm going to take the point of view, energy, youth energy. That's what you got. And it's wonderful. And utopianism, unfortunately, is part of it, but it's got to be part of it. But watch out for ideologies. Myself, I've settled with Northern European style social democracy. I think if we can balance between capital and labor, capital up here and labor way down here, if we can bring that balance a little better. But anyway, youth energy, that's what you guys got, and thank God for it. And I'm waiting for you to come and save the day.
Let me just add a little piece of analysis to this, Mark's enthusiasm and Mike's discipline, and that is this: capitalism. When capitalism is in crisis, it tends to move toward fascism. It tends to answer its problems with the answer of fascism, and we saw it in the last century. And we're seeing it in this one. And capitalism is in crisis now. It is in crisis. It does not have the room to maneuver that it has had previously. And we're in a situation of vast disparate wealth from between poverty and great wealth in the hands of the capitalists. And they are scared. If you don't know it, they are. And this is a very dangerous time, a very, very dangerous time. So as part of your struggle, you have to keep your eye on the reactionary right, and you have to work against them. And that does not mean picking fights with them in the street, as the fights were between the Spartakists and the SA in Germany. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it, we don't really even know what the way to do it is, but it involves keeping on track with doing things that are good for the people, and presenting options for them, and presenting the truth as loudly as we possibly can. I know those things are part of it. What the program should be, I can't tell you. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I can't say any of us know, but I think you all have really provided some really interesting, helpful advice and words of warning and wisdom. I mean, it's just like, I think something someone said in the chat, it's so interesting and like inspirational to have this kind of space where we can talk to people who were involved with movements of the past, learn from them, and see, you know, what can develop from what we have going now. So I really appreciate all of you being here. It's been a really great panel, a really great discussion. And I think I will pass it off to our next panel. So stick around.
Great.
Uh, education economy coming up next.